Everyone has strong opinions about expensive wines. It can be a very polarizing topic, but I've long felt that sunlight is the best disinfectant, so in this video, I'm just going to discuss it. My personal approach to spending on wine has changed dramatically since I first got into it. The first few years, I was probably in the $25 to $30 a bottle wine category, even for wines that I thought were more special occasion wines. Then one night, I was at a local wine club where I've been a member for many years now, but the very first time I visited there, I was just there to pick up a couple bottles of wine that someone had recommended and that were probably at $12 or $13 per bottle. But I picked them up on a Friday afternoon, and there were probably 10 or 12 people who were all enjoying wines, and they were all sharing them amongst themselves. They welcomed me to their table and let me try a number of these wines, which were absolutely crazy wines. Lots of top Bordeaux, some 100-point wines, and even a 1953 Sandeman's port. Towards the end of the night, the proprietor of the establishment told me that it's customary for everyone to share like that and encouraged me to purchase a bottle to share with the rest of the group. Of course, I didn't have anything that would rival what they were opening, but he encouraged me to purchase a bottle that sold for about $50, and it's what I would call a cellar defender today. But it was a 2000 Bordeaux from the right bank that was showing extremely well at the time. For me at the time, $50 was a lot of money. I never spent more than $30 or $35 on a bottle to that point, and I had to think long and hard about whether it was worth it to spend that amount of money on that bottle at that time. Ultimately, however, I said, what the heck, I'll live a little bit, it's a Friday night. And so I bought the bottle and shared it. Certainly my personal approach to spending on wine has changed quite dramatically since that time, but given my experience, I can certainly understand both points of view. Over the past 20 years that I've been collecting wine, I've heard two arguments regarding expensive wine. First is that it's a scam. You're paying for the label, for the story, for a lifestyle. That the wine in the glass isn't meaningfully different from something that costs only 1/5 of the price. The second is, of course it's worth it. You get what you pay for. You're paying for terroir, for wine production costs, and for limited quantity. But I think they're both asking the wrong question. The question is not whether expensive wine is worth it in the abstract, but whether expensive wine is worth it in a particular situation, for a particular purpose, and compared with another alternative. Of course, everyone will have their own personal approach to this subject, but I thought it might be useful for me to go through when I personally believe that it's worth paying up for expensive wine and when it is not. The first instance in which I believe it makes sense to pay up for an expensive wine is when you want to enjoy a wine that's at peak and you don't want to wait or you don't have a place to cellar it. Many top wines, including Bordeaux and Burgundy, become extremely special and much more complex with additional age. Many people want to just buy a wine and enjoy it either that night or within the next week or so. If you're in that category, you're definitely probably going to be better off paying up for a wine that's been stored properly and which has reached its peak. 1990 Bordeaux, for example, is incredibly special and showing remarkably well right now. But there's a lot less of that wine now than there was 30 years ago. For that reason, you'll have to pay a premium for it, especially if it's been stored well over the last 3 decades. But what I see happen all too frequently is that someone will pay up for an expensive wine, but it's a younger vintage that's still available in retail channels, and then they'll open it way too soon. If younger wine makes them happy, that's fine, but the problem that I see is that they drink the wine too soon, and then they decide that it wasn't really that good, and they don't understand what all the fuss was about. The problem is when these wines are young, they're mostly just primary fruit, sometimes with some oak influence, and they're not that distinguishable from a number of other wines in the market that sell for much less than that. I've even seen these comparison tastings where someone will express dismay that a $30 wine could be showing better than a wine that sells for $150. The problem, of course, is that the wine that sells for $30 was meant to be enjoyed young and is already at its peak, whereas the $150 wine probably won't reach its peak for many years yet and is not even supposed to be opened anytime soon. So when you purchase a bottle of aged wine, you're not just paying for the wine itself, but you're also paying for the convenience of not having to store it properly yourself for many, many years before you enjoy it. Of course, another situation where it makes sense to pay up for an expensive wine is where you're intentionally planning to age that wine and save it for a special occasion many years down the road. This could be a birth year wine for your children, a wine to celebrate your wedding anniversary, or some other special occasion, or it's just a really epic vintage of a wine that's one of your favorites and you want to be able to enjoy it some point down the road. This could be the case with a wine like 2016 Chateau Latour, for example. In that situation, it absolutely makes sense to pay up for a nice wine. This next situation is probably the one that I feel most strongly about. Unfortunately, it seems that many people skip it altogether. But when I first got serious about wine collecting, I made a conscious decision that I wanted to taste as many high-end wines from top producers as I possibly could. I almost used it as a checklist. For example, I wanted to try at least one wine from every first growth Bordeaux. Then I wanted to try some of the top Super Tuscan wines like Ornellaia, Sassicaia, and Cellar. I wanted to try some top Burgundy wines from producers like Loire and DRC. This continued with wines like Vega Sicilia's Unico, some of the cult producers from Napa Valley, and the top champagnes in the world. This is a list that's continued to this day, although my bucket list is definitely much shorter now than it was before. But in the process, I learned an incredible amount about my own taste and preferences. I determined that some of these wines are worth paying up for me personally, whereas others are not. For example, as an attorney, I tend to be a little bit risk averse. I'm also somewhat competitive and hate losing. Many of you will think I'm crazy, but I've been to Las Vegas 12 or 13 times, and most of the times that I visit, I don't even gamble at all while I'm there. And so buying a bottle of Burgundy that was kind of hit or miss and would either be a life-changing wine or a total train wreck and get poured out was something that I really couldn't handle mentally. When the bottles were flawed, I found that it ruined the whole night for me, and I was unable to enjoy the rest of the evening. So even on those occasions where the wine was exceptional, it didn't really make up for those downtimes, and I didn't want the ups and downs associated with spending a lot of money on collectible Burgundy. In contrast, wines like Bordeaux, the Rhone, and Napa Valley have some very consistent wines, and so I tended to focus on those categories. This is how I also made a discovery that really changed my approach to wine collecting. In particular, fairly early on, I tried some of the Gigal Lala wines, and I was absolutely blown away at Syrah from the Côte-Rôtie region of France. Had I not undergone this exploratory phase, that's probably a category that I wouldn't truly appreciate to this day. Far too often, I see people just being critical in the abstract, despite the fact that they haven't even tried the wines. So in my view, there's absolutely no substitute for tasting these wines yourselves and forming your own opinion about whether they are worth it personally for you to purchase. Importantly, this process will also help you decide for yourself the answer to the question that I'm asked most frequently, and that is some variation of the following. Should I buy one bottle of bottle A for $500 or two bottles of bottle B for $250? Or 5 bottles of bottle C for $100? That's an extremely difficult question for me to give advice on because I think it varies wildly by person. For me, there's some instances where I would pay $500 for one bottle, but there's other situations where I wouldn't pay more than $100 for a bottle. So it really all just depends. I've done this long enough to know that there's probably a number of you who watched that last segment who are either writing a nasty comment or thinking about doing so for one of two reasons. First, you're thinking that it's a huge mistake to just write off Burgundy because it's the best wine in the entire world and no self-respecting wine lover would simply ignore that category. Second, you're thinking that you can't possibly afford some of these wines for yourself, so that this video and my advice is idiotic and ignores the reality. If that's what you're thinking, you're wrong on both counts. I love Burgundy, and I look for every opportunity I can possibly find to taste high-end Burgundy. I just don't like buying it or paying for it myself. Second, there absolutely is a way for you to try many more wines than you ever thought possible given your income or asset levels. That takes me to the next situation where I think it's definitely worth paying up for expensive wine, and that is shared tasting experiences. With our collector group, for example, we typically get together 4 or 5 times a year, and we'll either each chip in a bottle of expensive wine along a theme, or we'll go out and we'll purchase wines and each kick in our pro rata share of the cost to buy those wines. That's when I found that it works best for me personally to pay up for Burgundy. For example, a few years ago, we did a tasting where we tried 4 different bottles of DRC from the 1990 vintage. These are wines that I would never be able to afford myself personally, but it was much more palatable for me to be able to try these wines that I never would have tried otherwise by kicking in 1/8 of the cost for those wines. The same is true for a tasting of Loire wines that we did a few years later, and so on. There's so many advantages to tasting these world-class wines as part of a tasting group with like-minded individuals, it's almost difficult to recite all the advantages. But to give you just a few, first, if any of the wines are flawed, you know that you'll at least have some other wines to offset that. We typically have 6 to 8 wines as part of the tasting, and there's typically never more than 1 or 2 bottles that are off. Second, you get to try far more of these wines this way than you would if you were just buying and trying 1 bottle at a time on your own. Third, you get to compare and contrast these wines side by side, which really tells you a lot more about your preferences than if you just have one of these bottles in isolation every several months or so. For example, if you only have 1 first growth Bordeaux at a time, you'll most likely enjoy all of them, but you won't necessarily know whether you prefer Haut-Brion to Latour. The next situation is a bit of a hybrid. For the most part, historically, during the week, I won't necessarily splurge on a really expensive bottle of wine or open a special bottle from my cellar. Instead, I'll focus more on an enjoyable pairing with whatever I'm eating that night. So, for example, one of my favorite pairings would be Brunello di Montalcino with Ossobuco. There, it doesn't necessarily have to be a 2004 Biondi Santi. Most solid Brunellos will make an exceptional pairing with that dish. Similarly, a really nice Syrah or Shiraz will go incredibly well with a burger, and so on. Having said that, there have been some Monday or Tuesday nights when there's been nothing better than to open an expensive bottle of wine and just enjoy it over the night on the patio, or perhaps meet at the wine club with a group and get the week off to a strong start on a Monday night, each opening a very special bottle and comparing them. If that's something you've never tried before, I definitely recommend that you do it, perhaps some night when you've had either a really good day or a really bad day. Oftentimes I've found that the wine itself can create the occasion. You don't need a special occasion to open a bottle. Conversely, and this may be a bit of a hot take, but if there's a celebration going on, while I'll certainly enjoy a nice wine, I won't open some of the very best wines because those are the wines that I want to really savor and follow over the course of the evening. And if there's a celebration going on or there's a lot of people or excitement, it's very easy to not give that wine the attention that it deserves. Wine with meals, especially at restaurants, is also a category where I have a bit of a hybrid approach. Certainly there are some restaurants that have destination wine lists that have extremely impressive collections and where when you're there, it's definitely worth it to explore their list and try some interesting wines that you would never get a chance to try otherwise. When it comes to multi-course tasting menus, whether it's at restaurants or at home, I'll typically go more just for a good pairing than for an absolutely world-class wine. In those situations, I want the food to be the show, and I've found sometimes that it can be a little bit distracting, having a lot of courses coming and going while I'm trying to enjoy a nice wine. Also, if there's a large number of wines being poured, such that you're matching different wines with different courses, I found that I tend to rush through the wine and drink it too quickly so that I can move on to the next course. For that reason, I found in those situations it does not make sense for me personally to pay up for super high-end wines. Of course, I'm definitely interested in hearing your thoughts as well. Please let me know in the comments below if you have any strong thoughts about when it's worth it to pay up for expensive wine and when it's not. For those of you who want to take my advice and try the exploratory phase, where you taste some of the best Burgundy in the world, please be sure to watch this video above where I do a deep dive into famed Burgundy producer DRC.